Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Yakino. On this week's episode, we have another special guest, Mark Greenberg of the Migration Policy Institute, joining us to talk about the refugee admissions cap and explain the role the Office of Refugee Resettlement plays in overseeing the custody of unaccompanied migrant children in the United States. Then, we'll have a conversation with This Week regular Theresa Cardinal Brown about Vice President Kamala Harris's upcoming trip to Guatemala. More of that to come, so stick around. On last week's episode, BPC fellow Ruth Wassam joined us to give an overview on the presidential determination process for refugee resettlement in response to the news that the White House reversed its original decision and raised this year's admissions cap to 62,500 refugees. This week, Mark Greenberg of the Migration Policy Institute joins us to continue the story and analysis. From 2009 to 2017, Mr. Greenberg worked at the Administration for Children and Families in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He served as ACF Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy from 2009 to 2013, Acting Commissioner for ACF from 2013 to 2015, and Acting Assistant Secretary from 2013 to 2017. ACF includes the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which has responsibility for both the refugee resettlement and unaccompanied migrant children programs, and has a strong research agenda relating to the programs under its authority. Mark has a deep institutional knowledge of the inner workings of ORR, and we are delighted to welcome him to the show this week. Mark, I leave you in Theresa's capable hands to kick off the first segment of the show. Welcome.
Mark, thanks so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration. So last week, we spoke with Ruth about the administration's decision to keep the refugee admissions cap for the current fiscal year at 15,000, which was the limit set by the Trump administration and the lowest admission since the current refugee program was set up in 1980. But last week, they changed course and did increase the ceiling, this time to 62,500. News reports of kind of some behind the scenes back and forth in the administration seem to indicate that there was concern coming out of HHS about the strain on the Office of Refugee Resettlement from the unaccompanied children and how that might impact expanding the refugee arrivals. So your background is over there at HHS and the Administration for Children and Families, which oversees ORR. First, just tell us about the relationship between the two programs in the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the refugee program and the unaccompanied children program.
Sure, happy to. And I should say, starting out, that while I was there in the Obama administration, my knowledge about what has happened in these last weeks on this issue is really limited to what's in the press. But, okay. Within HHS, there is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and the two major programs it's responsible for are refugee resettlement and the unaccompanied children program, along with some smaller programs. And they typically involve separate staff doing very different work. The refugee resettlement program is responsible for benefits and services after refugees arrive in the country. So they're not involved in the admissions process, they're not involved in the vetting process, they're not, the initial 30 to 90 days after refugees get here is done through something called Reception and Placement Program at the State Department, and then ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, funds benefits and services typically after that period.
So let me pause you there. So they fund those services that are provided by other organizations, right? So they don't operationally do that work themselves. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're not providing direct assistance to refugees. Every state has a refugee coordinator, or in the case of Texas, 4 refugee coordinators. And the refugee coordinators are typically in state government, although sometimes non-governmental organizations. And the refugee coordinators are responsible for administering social services, funding for arriving refugees, and providing cash assistance and medical assistance for up to 8 months for refugees that don't otherwise qualify for mainstream programs. So what ORR is really doing is issuing those grants and contracts and then monitoring, assuring compliance with them, but it's really a contract-related function with some policy connected with it. It's not about providing direct service to individual arriving refugees.
Great. So let's contrast that with the unaccompanied children program then.
So unaccompanied children is quite different. And for unaccompanied children, they arrive at the border, are typically apprehended by Customs and Border Protection. Then under normal circumstances, Customs and Border Protection has a responsibility to get the children to HHS within 72 hours, absent exceptional circumstances. And then HHS funds the network of shelters and other facilities. The children go to these facilities, they receive services there. There are efforts made to determine if they've got a parent or other appropriate adult they can be released to. So on the unaccompanied children side, HHS, through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, is funding this network of facilities. It's providing policy for them. It's providing oversight and monitoring for them. It's involved in having its field staff go out and spend time at the facilities. It's involved in reviewing release decisions for children. It's involved in services that are provided after children are released. So it's a very different kind of work than the work done on the refugee side.
So it sounds like for the unaccompanied children, it is much more hands-on operational work, even though there's contracts available, but there's a lot more direct relationship to the migrants.
Absolutely. And again, HHS isn't interacting with the individual arriving unaccompanied child, but they are spending a lot of time working with the shelters and facilities. And then if something goes wrong at a facility, there's what's called a significant incident report that comes to ORR. They need to review it, investigate it, determine what needs to be done on the basis of it, either for the individual facility or if it raises some kind of broader policy issue. So there is just an enormous amount to be done in the ongoing engagement with the shelters and facilities. And that's, of course, made far more challenging when there is a sudden need to greatly increase the number of facilities.
Yeah. So we're going to turn back to the refugee side for a minute. So, we know that many of the nonprofits that actually provide the services on the ground to refugees have scaled back in the years that the Trump administration cut the refugee resettlement numbers. One of the things the White House said with regard to setting the cap for this year was the challenge of scaling everything back up. So talk to me about the relationship between what ORR would do in sort of helping that scale up happen versus what happens either at the states or with the non-governmental organizations.
So as you indicate, a number of the organizations involved in providing services for arriving refugees faced significant cuts during the Trump administration. And it resulted both in loss of staff, in some cases, longtime experienced staff, and it resulted in multiple office closures around the country. So there is no question that it had an adverse effect on their operations. At the same time, these resettlement agencies had greatly looked forward to increased refugee arrivals, looked forward to the challenge of enhancing their capacity in order to be able to receive arriving refugees and provide services to them. And over these last years, there has been a recognition that if there was a change of administration, that it would likely be accompanied by new numbers and increased refugee admissions. So there is absolutely a rebuilding challenge for the resettlement agencies, which, again, I think they welcome. I'm confident they welcome. In terms of ability to receive people this year, what I note is there are really two pieces of this. I mean, one is the admissions part of the process, what happens overseas and how many people are in the pipeline. But then the other is the ability to provide services after people arrive. And again, for resettlement agencies, that is going to require expanding staff, in some cases expanding offices. For the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that's not what they do. They're issuing the grants and contracts. And so it may mean that a grant will be bigger than it would have otherwise been because it needs to involve serving additional refugees.
And I imagine that the non-governmental organizations that do the service providing at the end of the day, part of their funding, probably a significant portion of funding, is funneled through from the states from these ORR grants, correct?
That's right. And the way that it typically works is when refugees first arrive, they are greeted by a resettlement agency funded through the reception and placement program. That's in that first 30 to 90 days, and that's meeting the refugee at the airport, arranging for housing, helping children get enrolled in school, helping adults with English language learning and get jobs, and sort of cultural familiarization with their community. Then beyond that, the states have funding for resettlement services. They will often be contracting with the same resettlement agencies for providing those services, though they can be and often are contracting with additional entities too.
So what's your sense, I mean, based on your understanding of the program and the volumes we're talking about here? The White House, even though they raised the cap, still said they're skeptical they're going to be able to hit it this year. What's your sense? What's the likelihood, and where's the real crunch and challenge going to be?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is going to be how many people typically use the term of in the pipeline, and how many people are in the pipeline and how many are close to being able to enter the country. If for those who are able to enter the country, I'd be really surprised if capacity on the ground is a significant constraint on the ability for them to come in and receive needed services.
So you think that these nonprofits are ready to scale up and could do so fairly quickly? It's really how many people have been cleared and vetted and are ready to get on a plane?
I think that's the biggest factor. I think that's the biggest factor. And again, nobody is saying it will be easy, but it's work people really look forward to doing.
Yeah. So you talked about how a lot of what ORR does for refugees is money. So let's talk about money. Let's talk about the budget. Politico this last week was reporting that HHS officials had told Congress in April that they were reprogramming $1.3 billion from other parts of HHS's budget to cover increases needed to cover the increase in unaccompanied children. So do you think that affected some of the decisions around this? Could they have moved money out of the refugee side of the house and over to the unaccompanied children side of the house?
Well, the New York Times actually reported this weekend that that is what happened, and that $85 million was moved from the refugee program to unaccompanied children. And the reason that can happen is in the federal budget process, the refugee program and unaccompanied children are actually in the same budget account. And what that means is that from year to year, it is possible to move money between refugees and unaccompanied children in either direction, depending upon where the need is. And this year, when there has been this big increase in arrivals of unaccompanied children and large unanticipated costs, one of the things that the administration has apparently done is, in addition to moving money from other parts of the HHS budget, also move money from the refugee program.
Going back to thinking about capacity building in the refugee side, if ORR has fewer dollars to give in grants to the resettlement agencies because they've had to hire and and give contracts to expand their child influx facilities, that could impact the volume of refugees to settle. Do you think so?
It certainly doesn't make anything easier, but
Fair
but what does happen is that, and not to get too in the weeds here, but the how much an arriving refugee or refugee family costs in a fiscal year depends on when they arrive in the fiscal year. So that if they arrive earlier in the fiscal year, there will be greater costs than the year ends at the end of September. If they arrive in July or August or September, there may be more costs next year, but they're going to be pretty limited this year. So what I don't know, when we just talk about a figure, whether it's 62,500 or whatever the figure might be, how much it will cost in this fiscal year will depend upon when refugees arrive in the fiscal year, and then the real cost will be felt next year, and will be decisions for the administration and Congress around next year's budget.
Yeah, so we're already halfway through this fiscal year anyway. So if it takes a month up to 60 days to ramp up, that means they would be arriving later in the fiscal year. So the overall cost for this year may not be so high.
Absolutely. And so far, the number of arrivals this year has been really low. The Trump administration had set a cap of 15,000, but so far, through April, it is still less than 3,000 refugees that have been admitted.
So they weren't even close to meeting the 15,000 that they had originally set. So far, anyway. Yeah. So a lot of this is aspirational. They've still confirmed that they want to try to get, 135 for next year, if I remember correctly, if my math is correctly. So they are still looking for significant increases in the next fiscal year that starts in October, correct?
That's correct. They've really reiterated now the commitment to actually 125,000 for next year. And the 62.5 was intended to get halfway there. So the administration is indicating that they are very likely to fall short of that, but it's aspirational. It sends a really important signal about the commitment and the direction they want to go. And then there's going to be a lot to do to get up to 125,000.
So let's flip to the other side of the house and talk about the unaccompanied children. We've all kind of seen the struggles, if you will, that the administration seems to have had in the first months of its of the Biden presidency in just managing this significant increase in unaccompanied children at the border. Obviously, the Obama administration dealt with something similar in 2014, and Trump saw similar with families and unaccompanied kids in 2019. Overall, let me ask you, do you think the Biden administration was prepared for the number of children that arrived at the border? What do you think they might have done differently or better to manage this situation?
So the first thing I'd say is this is really hard under the best of circumstances, and these weren't the best of circumstances. What's happened this spring is basically has two main reasons. One is that the number of children that arrived were much greater than had previously been the case. And the other is that the capacity to receive arriving children was much less than it needed to be. And there's basically a story about both of those. In terms of arriving children, the numbers have, at least relative to the past, have been high every year since 2014, with one exception, last year, 2020.
Right.
And the reason the numbers plummeted last year, partly because of the pandemic, partly because the Trump administration was expelling unaccompanied children at the border. When the expulsions ended, it was quite foreseeable numbers would go up, though I don't know that it would have been foreseeable that they would have gone up as much as they did in February and March and April. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is around capacity. HHS, ORR always its goal is to have enough beds for arriving children. It's really hard to know how many that should be because there is such big fluctuations from month to month and year to year. So the Trump administration actually had identified a preparedness level of 16,000 beds. When the pandemic hit, the number of available beds dropped significantly, and last year that number was not rebuilt, and the capacity was not rebuilt. So the net effect of it was when the new administration came in, the capacity was only about half of what had previously been identified for preparedness. And it's really this collision between increased numbers and reduced capacity that caused the many challenges of this spring.
Yeah. So, the challenges of increasing capacity rapidly, right? I think that's the things that we've seen. And we talked about it with regard to the refugee program. But, when you're talking about these facilities that have, I would say probably a lot of, I won't say restrictions, but requirements, a lot of very, very detailed requirements for facilities where you can place children, minors, even for short periods of time. And, the administration, to its credit, I think, decided that the capacity expansion should happen under HHS rather than CBP, right? So if you kind of go back to the last few times we saw unaccompanied arrivals, CBP was the first one to increase its temporary facilities before HHS did. And many of those facilities, I think people would say, were substandard. Most people think that CBP is not the place where unaccompanied children should be, certainly regular Border Patrol stations, but then the immediate things they expanded to included like, oh, we're going to put a tent over where we keep our vehicles next to the station, or we're going to have kids, outside in a chain link fence area with a tarp over it. That's clearly not acceptable. Then we started seeing facilities like the Donna facility or the Trujillo facility, which were tent facilities, which are somewhat better, but still, I think certainly didn't have all the services ORR. So talk to me a little bit about that expanding capacity challenge and quickly expanding capacity. I mean, HHS is putting kids in convention centers and arenas.
Yes, they are. And that's actually where probably most of the kids are now, most of the arriving children. So what happens is, again, under normal circumstances, under the law, CBP should be getting children to ORR within 72 hours. And when ORR doesn't have adequate capacity, that's when the backups occur at CBP. And I think it's very broadly agreed that those are really bad and should be avoided wherever possible. I do think there is more that CBP should be doing in order to be able to receive children and treat them in a humane and decent way for up to 72 hours. But the central part of the responsibility here really is HHS to have expanded capacity. Normally, HHS relies on state-licensed regulated facilities. And that's how it works in usual circumstances. When there is a sudden increase and they need to add capacity quickly, they can't turn to state-licensed facilities because in many states, the requirements for getting facilities licensed and regulated can take 6 or 9 months or longer. So they have to find something else to do. In the past, both the Obama and Trump administrations relied on federal property, either military bases or a Department of Labor facility, for what still is referred to as influx facilities. What's happened now, though, is that the numbers were so great and the need to expand was so urgent that they have turned to a new category called emergency intake sites, which are being operated in auditoriums, coliseums, very large buildings. And it was a way of getting children out of CBP quickly, but it has meant moving into these very large facilities where there are maybe cots lined up in a very big room with, frankly, thin staffing, less stringent check requirements for checking staff before they come into the facilities, less by way of services. And I think I absolutely understand the urgency of what led to it, but it's not where we would want children to be for any length of time, but it's what they have needed to turn to in the efforts to reduce the overcrowding at Customs and Border Protection.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the whole situation described as suboptimal, and I think that's maybe a little understatement. So let me ask you this. I mean, if you were still in government, what would you be focused on right now to help both programs at ORR achieve the goals that are being set by the administration? How would you, what are the key things that you think they should be focusing on and paying attention to?
So for the refugee program, the challenge is now, at least on the HHS side, it's very much about supporting and developing the capacity for receiving the additional numbers of arriving refugees. And partly that involves working with state governments so that governments understand how many refugees are coming, when are they coming, where are they coming, to be able to coordinate for the responsibilities that governments have in relation to them. There is strong interest in many areas in strengthening the roles of community groups and private individuals in further support of refugee resettlement. I think there's going to be significant attention there. We have been urging that the refugee program broaden its attention where there's typically a lot of focus on rapid employment for arriving refugees, but we've urged the need to broaden to the needs of the whole family, to young children, to older children with school and transition to adulthood. And, and my hope is that there's stronger attention to that too. And the last thing I'd flag on the refugee side is that asylees, when someone gets asylum, they are then eligible for the same benefits and services as refugees, but there's really not a good system to tell them that and to link them. And, and I would hope that they're going to take that up too. So that's on the refugee side. On unaccompanied children, there are much broader issues in border policy and in foreign policy in the relationships with the countries of origin and with Mexico. But for HHS, the main tools that it really has are around capacity and around the policies and procedures for releasing children to parents and sponsors. On capacity, I think the big challenge they now have is, from the latest numbers, something like 22,000 children in care, most of them in these emergency intake sites. For the foreseeable future, they're going to need a lot of capacity, and my hope is as quickly as possible, they can transition to better arrangements than the emergency intake sites and expand licensed care and expand the use of other kinds of arrangements, some family-based arrangements for arriving kids. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think that's going to be really important. The other piece of it is around the process of releasing children to parents and other sponsors. They need to go through a vetting process to be sure the person is really who they say they are. If they claim to be a relative, are they really? There are vetting around criminal records, sex abuse registries, other aspects of the process. Everybody, I think, wants them to speed the process, but at the same time, they need to minimize their risks of making mistakes that put children at risk. And Parts of that are straightforward. Parts involve some really difficult trade-offs, but I think that's what they now face.
Yeah, we've talked on this podcast and in other places at VPC, we've written about this idea of understanding that we don't control when the numbers of children coming into the border happen, that those are factors much beyond certainly ORR's control. That and as you said, now we have seen sustained high levels of unaccompanied children since 2011, essentially, probably going back to 2014 for sure. Do you think this is that the idea that somehow this is a temporary blip and so temporary capacity is fine? Or do you think we need to kind of rethink what the baseline here is?
So I think anybody who has been watching the numbers over the years would not expect that we're going to go back to the very early levels. It used to be 6,000 to 8,000 children a year. In recent years, it's more typically been in the range of 40, 50, 60, 70,000. So no reason to believe we're going back to that very early stage. And again, a lot of this does go back to underlying reasons why children are leaving their countries of origin and what can be done in foreign policy and in working with those countries of origin. But for arriving children, everybody, lots of people get frustrated when HHS doesn't have adequate capacity, but those are really hard judgments to make in conditions of lots of uncertainty where, the numbers are going to be high, but it matters enormously whether the number is 40,000 children or 60 or 70,000. And the easiest thing, if money were no object, would be to have a huge number of empty beds available at all times to be prepared for contingencies. But money is an object. It is a constraint in the process. And even if HHS had unlimited amounts of money, not every state and community would necessarily support opening up a shelter or having a shelter that simply remains empty because it might be needed, months or a year from now. So over the years, they have tried to identify what's a reasonable preparedness level that won't address all possible scenarios, but addresses most of them. They actually had been working towards that before the pandemic hit, and then after the pandemic hit, that preparedness level just wasn't in place for this year.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for bringing your experience and expertise to this discussion. I know I have learned some stuff that I wasn't familiar with before. Folks, you can find more of Mark Greenberg's work now at the Migration Policy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Thanks very much. I really appreciated the conversation.
So, Theresa, Mark's segment is the perfect segue to the conclusion of our episode, a brief conversation on Vice President Kamala Harris's upcoming travel to Guatemala and Mexico on June 7th to the 8th. And we've touched briefly about her role in diplomatic talks with Central America. And she's already spoken twice with the president of Guatemala, once with the president of Mexico, but this will be her first foreign trip as vice president. So, Theresa, can you give us a refresher on what was covered during Harris's prior talks?
So Kamala Harris and Andres Manuel López Obrador, the president of Mexico, have met virtually a couple of times. The most recent meeting was on May 7th. And during these virtual meetings, I would say that there was a lot of nice talk about working together to manage migration at the border. They talked about addressing the root causes of flight, including promoting economic development in southern Mexico and the Northern Triangle. They want to create a strategic partnership. The Harris mentioned in the last meeting that they have a package of measures that include trade and business development and investment, and they want to do a bilateral effort addressing smuggling networks and human trafficking networks. All of these are great ambitious goals, but there's not a lot of meat there. These are, I'd say, introductory conversations. These are top-line topics. If they meet in Mexico face-to-face, and when they do, hopefully they will put some more meat on the bones of these outlines. It is worth noting that after both bilateral conversations with the president of Mexico that President Biden had and now Vice President Harris had, the United States agreed to send additional COVID vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccines, to Mexico. So it does seem like there's a little more than just migration being spoken about at some of these meetings.
I mean, so you lead me to my next question. You know, there's these strategic talks. They're nice and fluffy. There hasn't been quite a lot of meat on the bones. Is there a particular goal, or is there a stated purpose of her upcoming trip in June, or do we not quite yet know?
I think we don't quite yet know. I think one of the things that's definitely true, particularly since she's going to Guatemala, is that it will be an opportunity for the vice president to hear from folks in the country exactly what the situation is on the ground there. Of course, she'll be briefed by members of the U.S. Embassy team that are in country. She'll probably meet with, obviously, members of the Guatemalan government, but hopefully she'll also have an opportunity to talk to, for example, USAID personnel or folks in NGOs who can tell her about what's really going on down there. In Mexico, she'll have the opportunity again to meet face-to-face with the president and the government of Mexico. Hopefully, as I said, they can kind of get to some of the details of what it is they want to do. What does this investment look like in southern Mexico? What could they practically do? Hopefully, she may have some specific asks of Mexico. We've talked on this podcast of what the things are that Mexico could do to really effectively help the United States manage migration at the U.S.-Mexico border, one of which is how well Mexico enforces its southern border with Guatemala. That having been said, there have been more National Guard, Mexican National Guard troops deployed at the border. That they aren't necessarily the right people to do it. One of the things the United States probably would like to see is more professionalism in the Mexican migration authorities, the Mexican asylum system, maybe cooperation in allowing and vetting more of the people at the U.S.-Mexico border for the see who's vulnerable that the United States might continue to let in. Obviously, right now, probably the biggest thing that Mexico is doing to help the United States manage the border is continuing to accept some families and single adults back, even if they're not Mexican citizens, under the Title 42 authorities. So how long Mexico will be willing to continue to do that is also a matter for speculation. So there are some concrete things that they should be talking about. And hopefully one of the goals will be to kind of get at some of those ideas.
So related, there has been some reporting that tensions are currently really high in El Salvador, where the new parliament just tossed out all 5 of the judges who sit on the country's highest court. And about 2 weeks ago, Harris said that we need to respond to what's going on in El Salvador. Do you imagine the current situation there will play into the talks next month?
I imagine that she might raise it with the Mexican president. Certainly the cooperation and having the United States and Mexico speak with some unified voice with regard to the issues of governance, corruption, impunity in some of the Central American countries could be helpful. But I think the bilateral with Guatemala will probably focus mostly on Guatemala. That having been said, the White House Special Envoy for Central America, Ricardo Zuniga, just this week visited President Bukele of El Salvador after a couple of aborted attempts. President Bukele had come to Washington in February, was not able to secure a meeting with the White House. When Zuniga went back down to El Salvador about a month ago, he was not able to get a meeting with the president. They finally met. And apparently Zuniga did express the United States' concern over the direction that the country is heading. I don't get that there was a lot of detail discussed about migration or cooperation, but I think that Zuniga's probably goal was just to kind of get a lay of the land and understand what's going on down there. He also met with members of the National Assembly that ordered the termination of these judges. You know, it's interesting. El Salvador right now isn't the largest sender of migrants to the border. They have seen a decrease over time, but they are a key component of the Northern Triangle of Central America countries, and the relationship with El Salvador is a longstanding one. It's also very important for El Salvador. More than 17% of El Salvador's GDP is generated by $6 billion annually in remittances from El Salvadorans in the United States. The Salvadoran government has continued to support Salvadoran TPS holders, which are the largest group of TPS holders in the U.S., to extend TPS and citizenship to them. So I would say that El Salvador has a vested interest in the migration channels between El Salvador and the United States. And so that may give the United States some leverage at the end of the day. But it's important to understand and kind of look at when Harris is going down, she's meeting with the government of Guatemala, which right now probably many would argue is the most stable government in the Northern Triangle. They also have issues with corruption, right? The prior administration there had disbanded the UN anti-corruption group that had some success there. But, when it comes to Honduras, there's a lot of speculation about the president of Honduras and whether or not he's implicated in various drug cartels. And obviously, Bukele is a populist and is leaning towards some authoritarianism. So one of the things early on Harris was asked about is how do you work with these countries if we can't deal with the governments? And that's an issue they have to figure out, whether it's working with non-governmental organizations or other civil society organizations in the region. That's something that they're going to have to focus on, particularly if they're looking at development and aid.
Thanks so much, Theresa. I think that's the perfect place to end it. Lots more to keep track of and talk about in the coming weeks on the podcast. That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Yakino. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahara and Ethan Plotkin produce and edit our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.